Welcome in. It's a weekend edition of Fifth Avenue Faceoff. I'm Chris Mack. How are you? Eric Tangradi joins momentarily. We'll talk to Ray Ferraro of the NHL on ESPN, as well as the Pens have a big weekend on tap, including a game that Ray will be covering against the Boston Bruins. You got to say it, as I mentioned the other day, when you say Boston Bruins, like Bob Aries says Bruins, you got to say Bruins, Broons. So the Pens take on the Bruins and the hated Philadelphia Flyers on Sunday. A big weekend of action. But let's first look back at a game Thursday night against the Nashville Predators that was played just the way you want games to be played this time of year. Before we do that, be sure that if you are listening in your Odyssey app, you go up in the upper right-hand corner there and you tap the little thing. It should look like three little dots, I would think, if you haven't done it yet. And it'll say follow. Bang. Follow this podcast. And then as soon as new episodes are available to you, you will be notified. Also, if you get it any other way you may get your podcast, follow the podcast. Be sure to leave a rating or a review, whether you're inside your Odyssey app, iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, whatever it may be. Leave a rating and a review. We appreciate it. Tell everyone how much you love Fifth Avenue Faceoff. And, of course, you can watch on YouTube as well. Search 93.7 The Fan, and our episodes are right there with all the other video content from 93.7 The Fan. You can tap the little notification bell there as well. And every time there's a new video from 93.7 The Fan, including Fifth Avenue Faceoff episodes, you will be notified. Man, it would be nice if you could do that with the Penguins. Just bing, tap a little button, and every time they played a playoff quality style of hockey, you would get a notification. Bing! Ooh, look at this. Turns out they're playing the way they're supposed to play. Right there on your phone. Wouldn't it be great? Yep, that's what happened Thursday night. You would have gotten one of those notifications. You would have got a bing, and you would have gone, whoa, look at that. The first period was exceedingly boring. That's just what we want. It is what you want. If you're Mike Sullivan, if you're a Penguins fan, as this team rapidly approaches the playoffs, look, the pair of power plays they gave Nashville in the first period on Thursday night, not going to work against better teams. The few breakaways or odd man breaks they gave up, not as many as they have given up lately, but a couple of those prime scoring opportunities that they gave up to Nashville, not going to work against better teams. Although props to Tristan Jarry, right? He played a quality game. He gets his first shutout since November, came up with some big saves when they needed him to, which is something we've seen Casey DeSmith struggle to do when he's been given these opportunities. He had an opportunity to do the same Tuesday in Detroit and couldn't. I know. Pizza. But Tristan Jarry was given the opportunity. He's failed in that regard several times since the turn of the calendar to 2023. He did not on Tuesday against the Predators. Given an opportunity to make big saves, Tristan Jarry came up with a few big saves, including one on a breakaway, including when the Predators put up a good chunk of a fight for a few minutes late in the third period. But really, for the most part, you look at Thursday's win over the Predators, and you see the Penguins playing the style of games through the first 30 minutes that may seem boring or dull, but that is just what they need. Play that quality, tight checking, responsible kind of hockey. Don't try to make too many plays, especially on the back end. Don't overpinch from the blue line in. And you'll put yourself in a position that when the opportunities offensively do come to you, bang, you take advantage of them, as they did. Jason Zucker continues to be just magic for this team. The guy is always in the right spot, always playing the way you want a guy like Jason Zucker to play in the role that he's serving, playing on Evgeny Malkin's left wing. And how about the setup from Brian Dumoulin? Handsy, downright handsy from Dumo, who you look at not just the evidence from your eyes and watching him play over the last couple of weeks, but when you follow up and look at some of the deeper metrics, the advanced analytics, if you want to call them that, possession stats, he really is playing well, Dumoulin, over the last couple of weeks. He's playing like the guy who was Chris Letang's wingman for a couple of Stanley Cup runs. He looked like it again on Thursday night. against the Nashville Predators. Again, we sprinkle some salt on all of this by reminding you, and I have to remind myself as well, it's the Nashville Predators without Roman Josi, okay? And UC Saros did all he could to still stand on his head, but it's just not a very offensively talented team, the Nashville Predators right now. And so you're not going to be able to play that quality of game. The depth lines still didn't have as good a game as they could have had, I don't think anyway. The top two lines played exceedingly well. But you're not going to be able to play this level, this quality against better opponents who you're going to start seeing Saturday in the Bruins. And then within the next week, you've also got games against the Devils and the Wild. Those are playoff teams you're going to get to play. And we'll see how the Penguins handle it. But for a night, Thursday night against Nashville, they looked like they could handle it. So props to Zucker, props to Dumoulin, props to Tristan Jarry, especially, who was the number one star of the night, and the Pens for playing a good old-fashioned, boring playoff-style game. It worked for them in that 2-0 win. I mentioned we're going to talk to Ray Ferraro of the NHL on ESPN. We'll check in with our good buddy Eric Tangradi as well, see what he thought about the win over Nashville and what's to come against Boston and Philly this weekend and over the course of the final week and a half of the regular season as the Penguins sit, as of the recording of this podcast on Friday afternoon, just 3 points behind the Islanders with a game in hand in the final spot of the Eastern Conference playoff race, and just 1 point ahead of the Florida Panthers, who they also have a game in hand on. We'll talk to Tango next here on Fifth Avenue Faceoff. Welcome back into Fifth Avenue Faceoff. Chris Mack at 93.7 The Fan and The Fan Morning Show with you, talking Penguins hockey. And once again, we've managed to nab one of the guys from the NHL on ESPN on their way into town as they get ready to fly here. Last week, it was Sean McDonough. This week, we're lucky enough to be joined by Ray Ferraro, who will be with Sean on the call of Pens Bruins at PPG Paints Arena on Saturday. Ray, really appreciate you hustling through security at the airport to give us a couple of minutes. Thanks.
No problem. As you know, you can only hustle as far as the 100 people in front of you, but it was a pretty quick line today, so I got through all right.
No, we appreciate it. Thanks again. I don't know how much of Thursday night's game against the Predators you got to see, from the Penguins. But being there in person, watching it, it struck me that we finally got the kind of effort from Mike Sullivan's team that may not be the most fun to watch all the time if you're a casual fan, but that is perfect for the playoffs if you're a team like the Penguins. It was, frankly, if you're a casual fan, boring hockey, uneventful hockey, but it's perfect for a team like the Penguins going into the playoffs. It struck me that it may be just the right prescription in that they bottled up, granted, not an offensively gifted team in the Predators, but they bottled up their opponent and struck when they had opportunities. That seems like the right style for this team going into the playoffs. Can they play that way against the Bruins or anybody else they might face in the playoffs?
That's really the $1 million question when you look at the Penguins. I mean, I think when we think of the Penguins, because of Crosby, because of Malkin and Letang and Jake Gensel, I think the first inclination is this is a high-scoring team. This is a team that's going to score a lot of goals. It's going to have a really great power play. And none of those things are true about this team. And so you got to be careful of looking at one game. You mentioned about Nashville. So no Roman Josi, no Philip Forsberg, no Matt Duchene, no Ryan Johansson. So I would say probably their four best players weren't in the lineup. So it's easier to bottle that team up. For two periods the week before against Washington, they got a great game from Casey DeSmith, but they played a style that looked really comfortable for them. They were relatively in control of much of the game, yet in 5 minutes in the third period, the game flipped on them. And all of a sudden it's a scramble, and it's that story that's been written many times this year. The Penguins are interesting to me because, I watched the later game last night, Edmonton and LA, and, Stu Skinner made 43 saves in goal for Edmonton, and, they shut out the Kings. Well, Stu Skinner doesn't have to be the story in Edmonton. He's got to make sure that he doesn't screw up the train, right? Like that's what the goalie in Edmonton has to do. In Pittsburgh, the goalie has to be better than that. Their defense isn't good enough to withstand average or sub-average goaltending. So, I understand the frustration of Tristan Jarry and his injury problem this year, or problems. He's their best bet. He's a better goaltender than DeSmith. DeSmith can play 1 out of 3 games for you, but Jarry's got to be the guy. So yeah, the style looked great, but you got to take the opponent into consideration. And I think you really have to understand that Tristan Jarry is incredibly important to that team.
Is this an opportunity for him then, Ray, over the next week? Because they've got the game against the Bruins, obviously. They've got the Devils and the Wild on the schedule as well. An opportunity. Look, they're fighting and scratching and clawing for every point in the standings to stay ahead of Florida at this point, but an opportunity for Jarry to assert that he can play that style, I guess.
100%, and they're going to need him. Now, look, for 2 periods the other night, or last Saturday, Casey DeSmith was the story. He was fabulous, unreal. He was terrific. Stops Ovechkin on a breakaway, makes a great save on Carlson, lets the Penguins grow a 3-0 lead. And then 2 games later, you see him having some problems. With all due respect, because he's one of the probably 60 best goaltenders in the world, he's a backup goalie.
Right.
And that's what they signed him to be, is their backup, to be their B guy to their A guy. The problem is the A guy has not been able to play like that, certainly since the new year when he got hurt on January 1st and came back. It is an opportunity, but it's also, you don't have any time to figure it out. If the game Saturday doesn't go well, then Mike Sullivan's in the soup for who do you start against New Jersey the next day? Can you play them back to back? Do you have to split them anyway? Like, there's so much more that goes into that decision than, like who you're frustrated with as a media member or a fan. You got to go with the guy that gives you the best chance.
Right. Long term, what are your thoughts on the goalie situation here in Pittsburgh? Because Tristan Jarry is a UFA, and it's not a particularly impressive crop of young UFA goaltenders. I mean, there's Carter Hart out there who's been talked about. There's just not a lot else out there for them to chase. There's been the rumors kicked up again about John Gibson since he's a Pittsburgh native, but that would require pretty heavy lifting, I think, from Ron Hextall.
Yeah, it's I was reading last week, and and everybody, when I say everybody, the tone of the media was, you got to let Jarry go. You just go get someone else. Well, the someone else is who?
Right.
Because if you don't know who that someone else is, now you've got one goalie. That seems to be suboptimal, right? Yeah. You're going to need it. You're going to need at least 2. So the one thing that has happened here is whatever bargaining chip that Tristan Jarry had, he's left it at the table. Like he's in no position to have leverage going into this July. Now, if he goes into the playoffs and the Pens win a round and he's unbelievable and has a great second round, well, then the leverage will switch, because it's just not that easy to go and get another player, another goaltender in particular. Gibson's really interesting because I think you put it mildly saying it's heavy lifting. Like, man, that's going to cost you assets. You've got to clear cap space. Right? Like, how are you going to do that? Anaheim's not trying to be a really good team next year, right? Like they're still in their very base of their rebuild. So you're going to send, I don't know, what's Gibson's cap hit? Close to $6 million.
Six,
right?
Yeah.
So look around the Penguins. Do you see an extra $6 million sitting there? I don't.
Yeah, and to your point, I mean, that's who are you going to ship their way that they can immediately make use of as well? Their most immediate need is draft picks. So we know Ron Hextall's not interested in dealing, especially high-level draft picks.
You know what, Chris? I have this view or thought, I guess, is that the Penguins right now are like 2015 Detroit.
Yeah. Such a great analogy.
25 straight years in the playoffs, haven't made the playoffs since. Like when the ball turns over here, you're not just going to replace Sidney Crosby or Evgeny Malkin or Chris Letang. Like, how are you going to replace that? How are the Red Wings going to replace Pavel Datsyuk and Henrik Zetterberg and Nick Lidstrom? The answer is you can't, and you don't.
Yeah.
And then great, you get your draft picks, and then you wait, and you hope that some of those draft picks hit, because it's, you draft a kid, he's an amazing prospect. Great, he's 18. How many 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, 20-year-olds make a legitimate impact? The answer is not very many. They're in a tough spot, and that's why their chance to rebuild completely was last summer, with the Letang and Malkin contracts at the end. But whether that comes from Ron Hextall or comes from ownership or a combination of both, it's not that easy just to walk away. And then what? You have nothing. You don't have draft picks for them. You just lose them. Then what?
Yeah, and it strikes me, you talk about the comparison to the 2015 Red Wings, because I had the exact same thought earlier this week, Ray, and went back and checked, and I didn't realize that Henrik Zetterberg didn't win a playoff series, I don't believe, for the final 7 or 8 years of his career. And we are now in what would be, if the Penguins don't win a round of the playoffs this year, a 5th consecutive year for Sidney Crosby, Evgeny Malkin, and Christopher Letang. And you realize that when we've been waiting for the cliff all this time and the drop-off, we may actually be in the middle of it. And we don't even realize it. And that's what you're saying, essentially, is there's no easy way to rebuild. And when you do rebuild, you don't realize you're in the crux of it until you're already halfway through, essentially. And then you end up like the Red Wings, and you bring the guys in. You get the Larkins in some cases, or the Bertuzzis. But then in some cases, you're shuffling some of those pieces out. Again, i.e. Bertuzzi, who we'll see on Saturday. But it's not as cut and dried and easy as I think a lot of us wish we could make it out to be.
It's so different than the NFL when you're drafting 22-year-old players. And, for example, the Steelers draft a left tackle in April. He's starting for them. Mm-hmm. Well, they certainly hope, or he's that close to starting for him right away. You draft an 18-year-old kid, you shake his hand, and you say, our development team will be in touch. And then he goes back to junior, or he goes to college. And it's a couple of years before physically they can mature to even compete, because they're 18-year-old kids. Then they get there, and they're not even close to the player that you hope they're going to be. Right? Like, so I think management always knows they're in the middle. But if you have Crosby and Malkin and Letang, and let's say ownership says to you, okay, Chris, you're the GM, you're going to rebuild, and you've got these 3 guys. How are you going to be bad enough to get to the top of the draft?
You're not.
Yeah. You're going to be in the 20th draft pick again, and then they're still going to be there next year. So you try to stay relevant. You try to make the moves you can to stay as competitive as you can. But a rebuild, it sounds awesome. Lots of things sound great in theory.
Right.
So you put them into practice. Buffalo's 10 or 11 years. Yeah. Rasmus Dahlin's a first overall pick. They made a trade and hit a grand slam with Tage Thompson. Owen Power's a number 1 pick. Oh, they're waiting for those guys. I mean, Dahlin is 4 years in, and he's just getting to the point where you go, that kid's a star. Like
there's still
in Pittsburgh. The people in Pittsburgh are spoiled.
We are
the Penguins. They really are. Like, I used to play against them when they used to just run roughshod over everybody. Well, they drafted Mario at 1. They drafted a stroke of incredible luck. They get Yager at 5. They make the trade for Ronnie Francis. They're running out a power play of 5 Hall of Famers. Right. Oh, and then Mario gets older and he's got to retire. Oh, and here's Sidney Crosby.
You're right.
Who else gets to do that?
No, I say it all the time. It's a good. We've been spoiled. It's in a good way. We've been for the last 40 years. We've had one of the top 3, or you could say 5 players in the world on our roster at any single one time outside of maybe a 3-year window. We've been incredibly lucky. Let's bring it back to this weekend for just a second. And with the Bruins coming to town, Does this team have a soft spot, Ray? I mean, I don't see it. And I don't know if I see a team in the East that, if there is a soft spot there, that maybe you can identify a team that's equipped to expose it.
The only soft spot I see is their top two centers are 37 years old, but terrific players. And the way the Bruins are built, they don't need to be a legit number one center and get 95 points. Like, I think as a team, as a 25 or 23 man roster, the Bruins are perfectly constructed. They don't need Patrice Bergeron to play 25 minutes a game or 23 minutes a game. They don't need David Krejci to play 20 minutes. They need those guys to function in the space that they're able to as a 37-year-old player. You know, Bergeron plays with Marchand. Those two have been tied at the hip since they came into the league. And they've got a brilliant player and 53-goal scorer, David Pastrnak, who plays with Krejci most of the time. Their defense is exceptional and deep. And they've got the best goaltending in the league. You know, in Linus Ullmark and Jeremy Swayman. So, you asked the weak spot. Yeah, it's their two guys are older in the middle. 2 months is a long time for them to be healthy. And that's really the weak spot I identify. But I'd take my chances with that.
Yeah, that's not much of one either. Before I let you run, I just want to touch on a couple things from around the league, Ray, because there are things being talked about now that the NHLPA has a new president in place, and Marty Walsh. What I've heard from the reporting of Chris Johnston and Pierre LeBrun north of the border is that he's trying to get player feedback on the playoff format. As fans, we've argued about this a lot over the last 5 years or so, but how do players feel about the current playoff format and your conversations with them, and whether they'd like to go back to the 1 through 8?
Well, when you're playing, I don't think you really think about theory, about hypotheticals. What if we changed it to this? I don't think it's a general topic really for the people that I talk to. You know what is a topic from the players that I've talked to in particular, but also more than a couple of managers, is why is the playoffs not expanded? Why every sport, every other sport has expanded the playoffs. When I was playing, there were 21 teams. We used to joke it was the original 21. It's the original 6, but we called it the original 21. 16 teams made the playoffs.
Right.
Today, there's 32 teams and 16 teams make the playoffs. My son plays in Germany. And so they have one league. It's is it 18 teams? 18 teams. So if you imagine each conference as its own league, so you have 16 teams. You have the division still. The top seeds in each division get the 1 and 2 seeds. Teams 3 through 6 get seeded. Division doesn't matter in points. Teams 7 through 10 play a 2 out of 3 playoff series to become the 7th and 8th seed. Then you play 1-8. So here's what happens. Teams in 3 through 6 are fighting to get the division win. They want to be number 1 and 2 so they can have home ice advantage all the way through the playoffs. The teams that are in the 7 and 10, they're fighting to get into the 3 to 6 so they miss that opening series. The teams that are 11 and 12, they're fighting to get into the 7 and 10. There's 3 playoff races going on at the same time in each conference. I'm telling you, it is awesome. You can't even keep your focus as to who's advancing where. It's so great. I don't know why the league doesn't take a deeper look at it.
Especially when you've had a situation like in the Atlantic this year where it feels like Toronto and Tampa have known they're bound to face each other for 2 months now. And there's, sure, Tampa wants to get things right and get moved in the right direction. And you can argue about home ice to an extent. But in that series, does home ice matter that much? No,
but I do think that's the one everybody points at. I do think we have to look in a bigger picture. Let's say the season ends today, which it doesn't. Rangers play Devils. When's the last time that happened? I don't know. It would
not
be
often
Edmonton
enough.
Edmonton and LA. They would renew a playoff series from last year. Seattle's going to be in the playoffs for the first time. There's a lot of series that we haven't seen before, but I think there's an easy way to generate more interest, which is more revenue, which is a better share for the players and the owners, by going to a system somewhat that I talked about. I
No,
don't understand why it's not further investigated. Maybe it is being, but I'd like to see it implemented.
Let me ask you how much you'd like to see. We all heard Connor McDavid a couple weeks ago talk about how players were seeing the impact of the WBC in baseball. And it sounds like negotiations continue. Oh, it was phenomenal. Down to the final at bat of the thing, right? Ohtani and Trout. It sounds like things are continuing to slowly progress for a February 2025 World Cup of Hockey. But it's hard to get it planned given the situation with Russian players that they're in. I know that international hockey is, outside of the Stanley Cup playoffs, for my money, the best version of hockey. I remember the last version of the World Cup. It was phenomenal. It had fans plugged in the month of August of all times, right? How do you feel about how this can get done, knowing what the uphill battles may be in getting it done?
Well, anything that's worth anything, there's obstacles and potholes all over the place. And you have to slowly just chip away at what the real obstacles are. I believe the work to be done involves the time of the tournament, the framework of the tournament, insurance, who owns the rights, where does the money go? All that stuff has to be chipped away at. And that's before you get to something you have no control over, and that's the world politic influence. And that's, of course, the Russian players. Right. But I don't know anybody, like literally, I haven't talked to anybody that says the World Cup's a bad idea. I do hear it's going to be pretty hard to put together. Yeah, so what? Lots of things that are really hard to put together finally get put together.
Nothing worth doing is ever done easily, right?
No, it never is. It never is. If it is, my wedge game would be way better. It would be way better. And so I want it. I want to see it. I think the players want to see it. I would love to watch it happen before Sidney Crosby gets too old. Now, okay, I'm a Canadian. I was in the building in 2010 when Sid scored in overtime. I've never heard an explosion inside a building like that.
I mean,
yes, it was Canada. Yes, it was at home, but it was international hockey.
Exactly.
And it was the very best of the very best. And I broadcast a lot of that tournament. I'm telling you, you could feel it, how much it meant to the players. Not just in Canada, in the US, but I'm talking the European guys too. They love it. They're playing for their country means so much to them. I think it comes right through.
Yeah. Anytime you get high stakes, best on best hockey, you've got a prescription for just an absolutely amazing competitive environment. Before I let you run, I got to ask you, because look, I'm not trying to age either one of us, but I came of age as a guy. Like, I think back to my college days when we would stay up late. We would maybe skate, because a bunch of my buddies worked at the rink at Penn State. And we would skate, and then we'd stop. We'd grab some food on the way home, and we'd sit there. We'd play NHL on the Nintendo 64, and then we'd watch NHL Tonight, right? And in high school and college, that was you. That was Bucci. That was Barry. That is the pinnacle in the minds of people of a certain age of NHL Tonight. No knock on anybody else, or the point, or what Bucci's doing now, or what anybody at ESPN is doing, or any other network for that matter. But do you ever take a step back, especially when somebody calls you Chicken Parm for the 739th time? Do you ever take a step back and allow yourself to sort of bathe in the significance that has in the minds of hockey fans of a certain age, that era of NHL Tonight?
Not that per se, but what I do, when I do think of it and when we do talk about it, I think, like, I was playing still. Like, I was in the league.
Right.
And I get this opportunity from a man who just passed away. His name is Barry Sachs. And Barry was a big Ranger fan, and he knew me from the Islanders and the Rangers. I got traded to LA, and he called my agent and said, "Hey, would Ray like to try being on TV?" And so I come in with Bucci and Barry, and, just incredible people to work with. And, Barry was, he had this big New York accent, and he'd be like, "Oh, Sugar Ray, what do you think of the Rangers?" And he just loved it. Right. And so I think of that with incredible gratitude of like how lucky, like I wasn't thinking of retiring. I was playing, I was surviving. And I get this chance to work with people who I've known now for 30 years, which is amazing. And Bucci gave me this glimpse into broadcasting that, again, I didn't know what the hell I was doing. I was just the broadcaster, or I was a player pretending I was a broadcaster. So he'd say something, we'd be coming out of a commercial, and he'd say, "I'm going to ask you something about the Avalanche." And I'd say, "Well, what are you going to ask me?" He says, "I'm not going to tell you. I just want you to think about the Avs." Because he taught me to be prepared and to react to the question. And I tell you, I was terrified. I'm like, what's he going to ask me? Right. But it helped me learn about preparation. And so working with those guys was just the best. I'll tell you one quick story. I'm playing for Atlanta, and no, I'm now in St. Louis, the end of my career. And Yuri Fisher was this giant defenseman. And he's got me, there's a scrum, and he's got me pinned up against the back of the net. I'm not getting out of there until Yuri decides I can leave, right? I'm like, there's no way out. And Steve Yzerman skates behind the net, and he leans over and he goes, "Hey, Ray, why don't you analyze that?" And then he kept on skating. And I was like, if I could get out of here, I'd like to slash you, but I couldn't get out. So
that's great.
That was a great line.
Oh, that's good stuff. Well, I didn't want to let you go. I didn't want to have an opportunity to talk to you and let you go without telling you. It does. It's at least
awesome.
For guys of a certain age, it holds a very special place in our hockey fandom. That era of NHL Tonight, with a young Chicken Parm and Barry Melrose and John Buccigross. Again, nothing against the Bill Pito, Al Morgani years of NHL Tonight that preceded it or anything that's come since, but great job. And you guys continue to, you and Sean have done a great job with the games this year in ESPN's coverage. So keep up the great work, Ray. We appreciate you taking the time while you're traveling, and we'll look forward to Saturday's game against the Bruins. Thanks
a lot. The importance of the games always makes it more fun to do what I do. So Saturday's a big one, but I got to tell you, I just love doing what I'm doing. It's been 20 years, and I can't believe it that I still get to do it. It's been awesome. It comes through in every game, man. We appreciate your coverage. Thank you much. Be well. All right, you too, Ray. Thanks again. Peace. Wonderful stuff from Chicken Parm, Ray Ferraro of ESPN. The Pens against the Bruins Saturday afternoon on ABC and ESPN Plus, and one more game on ESPN ABC. That'll be a week from Saturday, Easter Saturday, as it were, against the Red Wings. That one a primetime game at 8 Eastern. But I'm glad we were able to touch on a number of different levels with Ray there. Long-term vision for the Penguins. Maybe we're in the middle of not going over the cliff, but we're in the middle of the decline already. We just never see this group get back to where we hoped they could get back to. A zoomed-in focus on the Bruins and the Penguins this weekend as well, and whether the Penguins can do to Boston what they did to a very, very deficient Predators team on Thursday night, and what they can do in some big spots against Jersey and Minnesota down the stretch as well. A chance to prove that Tristan Jarry can be a playoff caliber goaltender, a Stanley Cup caliber goaltender in the playoffs in a couple of spots down the stretch here. And then also some league-wide issues as well. Sounds like the World Cup is something that can and should happen. The question is just getting all of those different big block issues to fit together, as well as a playoff system that I thought really sounded very interesting from Ray. Having the idea of 1 and 2 guaranteeing themselves home ice through the first 3 rounds of the playoffs in the conference, and then 3 through 6 not having to go through, I guess we would call it a play-in round, right? And best of 3, 7 through 10. Very NBA-like, right? That was good stuff from Ray as well. And obviously his career in broadcasting with ESPN, which has now come full circle to doing games
with Sean McDonough after starting on NHL Tonight with John Buccigross and Barry Melrose. All right, Eric Tangradi had some previous engagements. He had to run. We're not going to be able to catch up with him for this episode, but we'll get him back on Monday. No worries. On Monday, we'll have the Bruins and Flyers games to react to, and we'll be looking ahead to a big game out in Newark on Tuesday night. So we'll get Tango back in here on Monday. Coming up next, I put a bow on this thing, and we talk about what to look for in these Bruins and Flyers games as the Pens continue to build, continue to push, and try to stay ahead of Florida for that final spot in the Eastern Conference playoff race. It is Fifth Avenue Faceoff. Welcome back into Fifth Avenue Faceoff. I'm Chris Mack of 93.7 The Fan and The Fan Morning Show in Pittsburgh. Thanks again to Ray Ferraro for joining. Again, if you're kind of surfing in and out of the podcast or the video on YouTube, Eric Tangradi had to bounce for today, but we will get him back into the fold on Monday. I gave some of my reaction to Thursday night's game, the win over the Predators at PPG Paints Arena, and how they played the kind of game they're going to have to play in the playoffs. That's the test now. I think as we look at this team, the Pittsburgh Penguins, your Pittsburgh Penguins, very poor imitation of PA announcer Ryan Mill there, a former boss of mine. Anyway, as we look ahead to the schedule, this is where we find out if they can do it. And do it is very vague, right? And nebulous. It is, I guess, tiered as well. Can they get into the playoffs? Can they, once they are in the playoffs, compete against the Bruins? Presuming that's who they're going to get in the first round. I think it may be difficult unless the Islanders fall to pieces down the stretch here for them to catch New York for the 7th spot and then get, I don't know, Carolina or Jersey, ? As that race is still tight for the Metro Division lead in the first round. But most likely it'll be the President's Trophy winning Boston Bruins as they clinch that on Thursday night as well for the Penguins. Can they do it? Can they not just get into the playoffs? I'm using fingers if you're watching on YouTube. My thumb, the first tenon of this thing. Can they get into the playoffs? Once they are there, can they then play the right way? And can playing the right way, i.e. boring, responsible playoff style hockey with high-level goaltending behind them, can that win a series? Those are the 3 levels there. I think the Pittsburgh Penguins could play we'll call it perfect game. And I think Thursday was about as close to perfect as they can get outside of, again, the 2 power plays they gave up to Nashville in the first 20 minutes and a couple of prime scoring opportunities late, but Jarry played well behind them, so they were to make up for that. They could play as close to a perfect game as possible. 6 times against the Boston Bruins. I think they're probably only winning 2 of those games. So here's the catch. Even if they find their game, the right game down the stretch here, and the opportunity exists to do so with the Bruins on Saturday, say what you will about the Flyers coming into town on Sunday, but then the trip to Jersey on Tuesday and back home on Thursday against another playoff team in the Wild. Yes, when you look at their final 7 games, only 3 are against playoff teams. Those 3 that I just mentioned, Boston, Jersey, and Minnesota. But those are teams that you will have to play the right way to beat. And we know it's a crapshoot as far as their games against the Flyers, the Red Wings, the Blackhawks, and the Blue Jackets, because you never know what you're going to get. They gave up a 4-0 lead to the Blue Jackets at one point this year and had to storm back to win. They gave up a 3-0 lead to the Red Wings just last week and had to storm back to tie it before losing anyway. They have been up and down, and they have not shown that they can play the right way for more than 60 minutes at a time. Heck, for more than 40 minutes at a time in many cases. Sometimes only 20 minutes at a time. If they can do that against the Bruins, the Devils, and the Wild, if they can put together 180 minutes of high-level hockey, you'll have a team that's not only going to get into the playoffs and not only play the right way come playoff time, but will have an outside shot of pushing Boston to the limit. But I think that's as far as it goes. I think that's the conclusion I've come to between watching them Thursday night at the arena, coming home thinking about it, and then talking to multiple people, talking to Rob Rossi from The Athletic, talking to Eric Tangradi via text, even though we weren't able to get him on the pod today, talking to Ray Ferraro, talking to our producer, Greg Finley, just talking to my co-hosts on the Fan Morning Show, Doran Dickerson, Adam Crowley, and thinking about Colin Dunlap and thinking about where this team goes once they get to the playoffs. It's no more than the first round, unless something major happens to Boston between now and then, or once the series starts. The best possible game from the Penguins over a matter of 6 or 7 games against the Bruins, probably, even if they play great, even if they play their perfect game, still probably only nets them 2 wins, even if it gets them 3 wins out of those 6 games. What happens in game 7? Again, unless there's, and nobody wants to wish for injury, unless there's a major injury that takes a key component out of the lineup for the Bruins, I don't see how the Pens get past Boston, even playing their best game for 7 games. Maybe there's a little bit of magic left in there for 87, 71, and 58. But that's the conclusion I've come to, that, hey, it doesn't mean I don't want them to go to the playoffs. I still want to get that opportunity, because once you get there, who knows what the hell can happen, right? We've all seen it happen before. And to widen it out to the scope of sports in general, we've all seen that anything can happen, right? This is the weekend of the Final Four in college basketball, and teams like Florida Atlantic and San Diego State are in it, right? We're just a year removed from the Cincinnati freaking Bengals being in a Super Bowl. Nobody saw them doing that in what was Joe Burrow's second year as quarterback. You never know what's going to happen in baseball once the playoffs start. You get a hot pitcher and a hot batter too. Anybody can end up in the World Series. So that happens in the Stanley Cup playoffs as well. You get hot at the right time. You figure some things out at just the right time. You catch an opponent who maybe has something unfortunate happen to them. Before you know it, you look up and you're 4 wins away from the Stanley Cup final, maybe. Or, again, more than likely, the Penguins could figure some things out. They could get into the playoffs, have to face the Boston Bruins, and do all the right things and push all the right buttons, and still fall short. And unfortunately, I think that's what we're in for. Either way, as I mentioned, another big week coming up. We will have on Monday 2 games to break down, the Bruins and the Flyers. We will get Tango, as I mentioned, back into the fold. Also looking to get some voices from the opponents next week, New Jersey and Minnesota, in on the action, both in Mondays and Wednesdays, as well as Friday's podcast next week as well. If you have not yet, inside your Odyssey app, AUDACY, follow Fifth Avenue Faceoff. You'll be notified as soon as new episodes are available, and you could go back and listen to old ones as well, because they're not dated, really. I mean, some of the game breakdown stuff is, but if and nothing else, it gives you an opportunity to go back and listen and look at it from a frame of reference of, oh, that's where they were a week ago or 2 weeks ago or a month and a half ago, and figure out just how far they have come, or perhaps in some cases not come. If you get your podcast elsewhere outside of the Odyssey app, please subscribe, rate, and review there as well. And can always send questions as well. Maybe we'll throw another Q&A at you within the final 2 weeks of the season. Another mailbag at the Chris Mack on Twitter is where you follow me. You can always leave questions there, or email me, Chris, CHRIS.Mack, MACK, at Odyssey, AUDACY.com. We will do it again next week after we see how these Penguins do against the Bruins and the Flyers over the weekend. And we'll talk about it right here on Fifth Avenue Faceoff.